Why don't we do the introductions and then I'll do the land acknowledgement after that.
Awesome, sounds good. Hey everyone, today we have two awesome speakers. First we'll have Dr. Brian Harvey, who is an assistant professor and my advisor in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at UW. Over the last 10 years, he's conducted research on the disturbance ecology of forests in coastal California, the US Rocky Mountains, and the interior Pacific Northwest. His research uses field studies integrated with large spatial data sets and analyses to understand the nature of forest disturbances in a warming world, exploring how forest structure and function are shaped by fire and insect outbreaks, their interactions, and climate. Much of his research is co-developed with partners and stakeholders to connect research to pressing issues in forest management. And his recent work at UW has focused on examining the drivers and effects of forest fires on the west side of the Cascades in Washington and Oregon. Brian was a David H. Smith postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder, received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, his master's from San Francisco State, and his bachelor's in geography and environmental studies from UC Santa Barbara. Our next speaker is Dr. Tania Busch Isaksen, who is an associate teaching professor and undergraduate program coordinator for the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. And she's a clinical associate professor in the Department of Health Services at UW. In addition to teaching and administrative responsibilities, Tania has over 25 years of environmental public health experience, working in local public, private, and academic settings. Tania maintains an active practice-based research portfolio focused on public health outcomes associated with extreme heat and wildfire smoke exposures, as well as climate change-related public health adaptation planning and response, and sustainable materials management. You may have seen her work on wildfire and smoke featured in recent news coverage from this past summer. Tania received her PhD from UW in environmental and occupational hygiene, her Master of Public Health from UW's EMPH program, and her bachelor's in environmental health from Colorado State University.
Thank you. That was great. Okay, so I want to do our land acknowledgement. And once again, this was developed by the Communicating Climate Center that Marion Bertram led last quarter. Land acknowledgement. As we begin our gathering, we respectfully acknowledge that our event today is taking place on occupied Coast Salish land and that the University of Washington is on the homelands of the Duwamish people. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders past and present and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and the water, and whose lives continue to enrich in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. Okay, take it away, Brian. I think you can share your screen.
All right. Thanks, Luann, and thanks, Jenna, for the introduction and for the opportunity to chat with you all today. Let me share screen and make sure, is that good? You can see that?
Yeah, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay. Great. So yeah, let's dive right in. Let's talk about forest fires and climate change in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going to set this talk up a little bit and then get into some of the punchlines with climate change toward the end here. I want to just first start off by acknowledging that this is the work of a lot of supporters, folks who have funded and support this work, as well as collaborators and partners from a wide range of groups. And so I'm going to be presenting a collection of insights from several different projects, as well as some synthesis of things that are going on outside of our work here. So when talking about forest fires or wildfires and climate change, it's probably a topic that doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, given what we've recently experienced in the last several years, and particularly with an exclamation point on it last summer, as some of what we're starting to see is unfolding in the Pacific Northwest, even on the west side of the Cascades. And so here's a satellite shot from that first week in September, and a shot on the ground near Lake Oroville in California of what we all remember seeing on the front page of the news last summer. And it's easy for us to get an idea that this is a brand new phenomenon in these landscapes. And so while we'll get to some of the things that we might be seeing that are potentially new, I do just want to take us a quick step back in time and remember that fire has been a part of these landscapes in the Pacific Northwest for a very long time. We have evidence in the pollen and fossil record. Apparently, if you combine those two words, you come up with fallen. And that tells us that there are adaptations to plants. There are very strong adaptations to fire going back millions of years. And that's anything from closed cones that release seeds when heated by fire to seed banks in the soil, thick bark, resprouting, all sorts of things that plants are really well adapted to fire. And we can find those records going very far back in time, millions of years. And then for the last 10,000 years or so, fire has been a very useful management tool by people who have been living here in the Northwest. And both the adaptations to fire, to a lot of our adaptations, and the way it was used by humans on these landscapes vary quite a bit across our landscapes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that varies in the state of Washington, at least, before we start getting into the climate piece here. Really quick, this is a slide that I like to show, and we can, if folks want to throw answers in the chat here, I have what feels like sometimes an infomercial question that I'm asking here, and the answer will sound even more like an infomercial with how outrageous it is. But any guesses as to what % of fire up to the last couple of years here, so this is 1984 through 2017, occurred on the west side of the Cascade Crest here. So this dotted line is the Cascade Crest in Washington. These red splotches are fire activity. Over the last several decades, any guesses as to what percentage fell on the west side?
I wanted to tell people that it opened up chat so they can give their answer.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
Let's hear it or see it.
Chat is open, guys. Oops, I think I just did opposite. Okay,
Oh.
Now it's open. Now it's open. Go ahead. There we go. 1.1%. 1.1%.
This is easy. You all are, someone already nailed it right off the bat. I want to say winner, 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 fire dinner from Laura Whitley Binder. It is
she's a sport, so we can't trust her.
Less than 0.1% of fire activity over the last several decades has been on the west side of the Cascades. So in other words, more than 99.9% of fire activity on the east side of the Cascades. And it's easy for us to think about that part as our fire-prone region of the state and not the west side of the state. However, if we rewind the clock, we would recognize very quickly that the west side of the Cascades is a fire-prone region too, just on a very different time scale. So while we see fire often visiting forests on the order of every few years to decades historically on the east side of the Cascade, on the west side of the Cascade Crest, fire rotations are much longer, such that a given patch of forest might not burn for several centuries to sometimes even a millennium between fire events. And so that tells us right off the bat that fire plays a very different role depending on where you are in the state of Washington or in different parts of the Pacific Northwest, and likely that climate change is going to have a different effect depending on where you are in the state. So I'm going to give a really quick fire ecology 101 of east side versus west side fires and the role they play, and then dive into what we can expect in a warming world in this region here. So I often use this story of kind of two sides of the mountain. We've got the east side story and the west side story in Washington. And I'll walk us through the fire regimes, and I'll go over that in a second, of what are the adaptations and typical fire characteristics on both sides, using the ponderosa pine forest as kind of the poster child for the east side and the Douglas fir western hemlock forest as the poster child for the west side. And I'm going to, in 10 seconds, give you all a primer on fire ecology. We're going to talk about frequency, size, and severity of fires historically, and that characterizes the regime of the role that fire played on both sides of the Cascades, and talk about the controls on those regimes, whether they were from fuels, weather, or ignitions in terms of what limited fire the most. And we love these triangles in fire ecology, so that's something you'll see over and over again. So we call this the fire triangle, with fuels, weather, or ignitions being the key constraints on fire activity. So if we were to hop into a bus and drive out to the Mission Creek area out near Leavenworth, Wenatchee, Cle Elum, sort of on the lower elevation slopes of the Eastern Cascades, not in the middle of the winter, but if we were to do that in the summer, we would experience a pretty warm, dry environment on any given day in the summer. And that's true with or without climate change. That's sort of the environmental conditions in this location. And what that meant historically was that the weather or climate conditions were rarely limiting for fire to occur in this area. Ignitions would have been plentiful through either human-caused intentional or unintentional ignitions, as well as lightning ignitions, and that the fuels through the fire regime, as we'll see in a second, would have been what would have kept this fire regime in check in terms of kind of runaway fire activity in this regime. And so because of that, frequent fire availability with the environmental conditions and ignitions being there, the historical fire regime on the east side, again, was this frequent, so we're talking years to decades, fire return interval, and therefore low severity fire regime, meaning when fires occurred, because they occurred so frequently, they would have consumed a lot of the fuel and undergrowth and easily flammable fuel that would have carried fire up into the crowns of trees. And so we would have had things that would have been low severity fires, where trees like ponderosa pine, through their adaptations of thick bark, would have been able to survive multiple fires throughout their lifetime, and sometimes dozens of fires in a several hundred-year-old tree like we're looking at right here. And they do that in these fire scars, which we'll look at in close detail in a second, because that tells us quite a bit about the role that fire played historically. Because of that frequent fire regime and those fires coming through and removing a lot of that fuel buildup, the historical forest structure on this dry ponderosa pine forest would have been much more like a savanna or a grassland with trees in it in some areas than a closed canopy forest that we often think of, because those fires would have come and removed a lot of those understory fuels. And essentially, I'll rely on a colleague, Bob Van Pelt, to walk us through a beautiful artistic drawing of what that would have looked like at time zero. 20 years later, a fire would have come through and burned up some of those smaller trees. You can see many of the larger trees are going to survive, even though they might have some torching on there. 40 years later, that forest structure kind of looks pretty similar. 60 years later, another fire comes through, maybe takes out a tree or two here and there. But after 80 years of this fire regime playing out, we would see that many of those large trees would have survived fire, and that would have maintained this open stand structure without a lot of fuel buildup in these forests. And if we were to go up to one of those surviving ponderosa pine trees and look at a cross section of that, it would have recorded very kindly for us fire scars where we could figure out with some dendrochronology using tree ring dating to figure out the exact calendar years of when those fires occurred. And so that right there is an excellent piece of evidence that tells us a lot about how frequent fire would have been visiting these forests historically. What we've done over the last 100 years, and I would extend this even over the last 200 years, once we started excluding fires from the forest removal of a lot of the original inhabitants of these communities, and then over the last 100 years with our more mechanized, technologically advanced with airplanes and things like that, firefighting, is we have removed a lot of fires from these landscapes. And this is probably a scene that we're all familiar with, because this is what we see happening when fires do get out of control now in trying to suppress those fires. And we've been pretty darn good at it over the last 100 years or so, to where if you look at that tree ring record, this is some work by Emily Heyerdahl a couple back right around 2000 that looked at sites on the east side of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington, and each one of these horizontal lines is a tree ring record, and each one of those black marks, tick marks, is a fire scar. And you notice that right around the early 1900s, all of a sudden we see this really big lack of fire. So we've got lots of missing fire in those landscapes. And when you've got lots of missing fire in those landscapes, you've got lots of fuel buildup and change to the forest structure and change to fire risk. In some areas, we've still got a lot of those fire-resistant ponderosa pine trees, but they are now surrounded by shade-tolerant shrubs and trees that have increased the biomass and fuel load 2 to 3-fold in many of these locations. And so we've set them up for perhaps uncharacteristically high severity fires that we are now really concerned about on the east side of the Cascades. Because when those kinds of fires happen, the trees that have evolved adaptations to survive fire do not have very good adaptations to reseed following fire when there's a big high severity fire patch that kills a lot of the trees. And so on the east side, which is probably a pretty familiar story to a lot of us, because it's something that has played out throughout dry forests in Western North America, we've got a situation where historical structure was something like this. Now we've got 2 to 3 times the fuel load and biomass, and we've got a race against the clock as the climate warms and fire potentials increase to try to set these forests up for a better outcome if fire were to occur, because the type of fire that is now occurring is oftentimes uncharacteristic in terms of how these ecosystems have adapted for a very long time. So that's probably a pretty familiar story to a lot of folks, because it is one that we hear a lot throughout Western North America. However, on the west side, if we were to go on to the wet and west side of the Cascades and talk about the poster child forest of the Douglas fir Western hemlock forest, now we're in a location where the environmental conditions are very different. On the west side of the Cascades, the weather and climate conditions conducive to fire activity don't occur very frequently throughout most summers. Even when we've got nice sunny summers in our sort of quasi-Mediterranean edge climate here, it's not very long stretches of time on the west side of the Cascades during most summers where you'd be able to get big fires going the same way that you could in the dry east side of the Cascades. And so because of that, it would have limited fire activity historically to where when fire does occur, the fuel available for fire is extraordinarily high and was not really a limit historically. And again, there would have been human-caused and natural lightning ignitions on the west side for a very long time as well. So on the west side, we think of this as a weather or climate limited regime as opposed to on the east side of the Cascades. And what that meant is that when fires historically occurred on the west side, oftentimes they were high severity fires because there was such a long period between fires and this long interval of an infrequent fire regime. When they did occur, there was plenty of fuel to burn, and as long as those conditions were right, climate and weather and ignitions lining up, you could have high severity fires on the west side. And again, we've got lots of paleo evidence that tells us that that is likely to be true over wide swaths of the west side of the Cascades with these very long rotations between fires. And we've even got documentary evidence that kind of came back in an eerie way this last year. The 1902 Yakult burn in Oregon and Washington burned over 500,000 acres on the west side of the Cascades during mostly the second week in September, literally the same exact time that we were seeing these fires occur in this past fall. And so we know that these fires have been there in the past. This is a picture of what those standard placing fires looked like in the past when they occurred on the west side. And so when we think about historical forest structure on the west side, this is probably what it looked like given long fire-free intervals. A picture like this on the east side or in these dry frequent fire regimes would tell us, whoa, this thing is way overloaded with fuel and we've probably suppressed fire for a long time. But on the west side, this is actually business as usual in terms of a typical fuel load when a fire were to come through. And instead of trying to survive fires, trees have adaptations to reseed or regenerate following fires in this kind of a fire regime. And so this is a Douglas fir seedling growing 1 year following the Norse Peak fire, which is one of our study sites on the west side. And Douglas fir is a tree species that its best regeneration opportunity is following a standard placing disturbance like a high severity fire. Now on the west side, the management over the last 100 years, while we have also had fire suppression on the west side, the effect that that has had on the fuel structure is pretty negligible compared to on the east side, because on the east side, that fire suppression means we could have missed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 fires in a given spot. On the west side, with several centuries between fire events, 100 years of effective fire suppression probably did not mean even missing a single fire in a lot of areas. And so what that tells us is that there are probably minimal changes to forest structure or fire risk in terms of fuel differences on the west side compared to what we would have seen historically on the west side. So a very different story than the changes to fuel from fire suppression that we do know occurred on the east side. Now, the 2020 fires in Oregon and Washington, I mentioned earlier that happened the same week as the 1902 Yakult burn. So some interesting lining up of temporal anniversary dates on these fires. And in that same week, over 800,000 acres burned on the west side of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington, mostly during the second week in September. And so similar kinds of conditions, essentially, it's our northwest version of the Santa Ana winds that we hear about in Southern California, of these east winds blowing and fanning the flames as they come back up and over the mountain range and leading to the conditions when you can have very explosive fire behavior on the west side of the Cascades. So the fires that we see today and high severity standard placing fire are probably not that much out of the ordinary compared to historical in terms of the fire itself and what it does to the forest in terms of killing large swaths of mature trees. Remember that picture from the Yakult burn in 1902? As far as you could see, there were dead trees from that fire event. And post-fire succession on the west side plays out over centuries to millennia. This is really an interesting place to think about how forests respond to fire, because we've started to begin collecting data at some of these fires that have occurred on the west side. And we are only in the first few little glimpses into the window of this very long chapter, or the first chapter of this very long book of how these forests respond to fire. So let me wrap up and then turn it over to Tania in a minute here. What should we expect in a warming world? Well, whether we're on the east side or the west side, it is pretty much unnoticeable or impossible to not notice, sorry, I should say, that the planet is warming and fire activity is increasing. These two things are happening in a very profound way that you don't need to be a scientist to understand. You just need to be paying attention to what's happening. And we do know that throughout the paleo-ecological record, all the way through the contemporary record now, that there is a pretty strong connection with heat and drought and area burned. So the amount of fire activity that happens. This is some work by Leroy Westerling, who's a fire climate specialist at UC Merced, that shows us a trend in temperature anomalies that is very closely tracked by the trend in the number of large wildfires across the Western US. We're seeing more early spring snowmelt as opposed to late spring snowmelt, which is allowing fuels to dry out earlier and earlier in the year through time. And the net effect of that is an increasing length of time that at least the weather and climate conditions are conducive to fire, to where we're seeing an increase in the fire length over these last several decades. And one way to phrase this, as some of my colleagues have in some of the news interviews following the fires in September, is that climate change is loading the dice. Climate change is by no means the only thing responsible for fire activity. We would certainly have lots of fire activity and have in the historical record before the recent climate change that we've been seeing. However, climate change increases the probability that you're going to have fuels, ignitions, and winds coincide with hot, dry conditions. And when those things line up, you're increasing the chances that you're going to roll the dice and all are going to come up with conditions conducive to fire activity. And this is happening in different parts around the globe, where averaged around the entire planet, the fire season length is increasing by about 2 weeks over the last several decades. So in other words, we can think about it starting a week earlier and ending a week later in the fire season. We also know that there is a human fingerprint on this increase in fire activity. Some folks, John Abotsoglu and Park Williams, a couple of years back, basically took the climate change attribution approach and sort of backed out of that the ingredients for fire to occur, and looked at how much of the question of how much of the recent increase in fire activity can we attribute to the anthropogenic climate change versus fire activity that we would have seen without the anthropogenic climate change. And so they used a similar modeling approach that a lot of the attribution studies have used in the IPCC and other approaches, and basically said, without the anthropogenic climate forcing, we would have seen this black line of increase in fire area over the last several decades. With it, we see this yellow line, and the two of those summed together are this red line of the observed activity over the last several decades. In other words, their main takeaway was about half of the increase in fire activity that we've been seeing in the last several decades can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change as opposed to natural climate forcing alone in terms of that piece of the fire puzzle. Again, realizing that that is one piece of the fire triangle there. How is this unfolding? This is a slide that it's getting a little bit tricky to update because I have to keep updating it every year. But in December 2017, if we look at a place like California as an example, December of 2017, California had their largest fire on record. That record stood for exactly 9 months. It was broken in August of 2018 by the Mendocino complex, and that record stood for exactly 2 years, where we've had several that have already eclipsed the Thomas fire record from 2017, and now the August complex fire burned almost 500,000 acres or hectares in California. I do want to say this is area burned. That's one metric, and we know that lots of evidence points to historical fire activity in California having area burned in some years on par with what we've seen. The bigger challenge and the bigger worry is a lot of these areas were those historically frequent fire forests. And so we're seeing large area burn and burn more severely than we would have historically is one of the main concerns in a place like California. Climate change, again, is not the sole thing that is causing a lot of the fire challenges, but it is certainly making the fire challenges more difficult and harder to contain. One way to think about this, I often talk about, is with fire suppression during the last 100 years or so, we've been able to sort of keep a lid on fire activity, but climate change is essentially continuing to turn up the temperature, and it's boiling over and over, and we can't keep that lid on anymore, even with all of the fire suppression we can throw at fire activity. And so there are lots of really tragic outcomes from a human and societal and health standpoint that are outside the scope of what I'm presenting. I know we'll hear more about that. But climate change is one key ingredient that is making these challenges worse. What does that mean going back to the ecological point? And I'll just end on a few takeaway pieces here. We are seeing climate change not only altering disturbance regimes by, in some places like in Yellowstone National Park, we're seeing the potential for what used to be long interval fires now becoming shorter and shorter interval fires. And in this case, the 1988 fires burned, and the system was very resilient and responded to that. When those areas reburned in a fraction of the historical fire interval, we see in some cases qualitatively different forest response. And so climate change altering disturbance regimes and now different post-fire conditions are altering how the forest is coming back in many locations. and perhaps slowing recovery. And then finally, if we look at this in a lot of the Yellowstone National Park is more in the comfortable sweet spot zone of where forests have historically occurred. If we sort of zoom out to forests more broadly and then zoom back into the lower tree line, the marginal forests, again, thinking back to those low dry forest edges where it would transition into non-forest, we are seeing in many areas fires that are followed by warm, dry conditions no longer conducive to post-fire tree establishment in those areas. And so there's this sort of retreat of the lower forest margins that's happening in some of the warmest, driest locations. And in many areas now, multiple decades following fire, still no post-fire tree seedling establishment. And then just to end us on a note of at least curiosity, on the west side, I will say it potentially could be a different story following fire. And it's a really long story that we're going to have a relay race of people involved and partners involved to be able to tell this whole story. But we can see these systems bouncing back and perhaps on their way towards these 700-year-old post-fire forests that we otherwise know as old growth forests. But only time will tell if our climate conditions are going to be shifting that trajectory towards sort of the 700-year rinse and repeat cycle of these forests. I should say burn and repeat, not rinse and repeat. Okay, so what does it all mean? Fire, crucial disturbance that shapes forests in the Pacific Northwest. The role that it plays in different ecosystems, using our sort of east side and west side as our poster child versions, totally different and really important to understand the differences that it plays in different ecosystems. Across all those ecosystems, warming climate is increasing the potential for fire to occur and changing post-fire trajectories in many places where that has been tested. And some changes are underway, but those changes, again, are going to be different. And the contexts for management and policy are going to be different, whether we're talking about dry, frequent fire forests historically, or the wetter, infrequent fires that historically occurred in other forests. So with that, I want to say thanks. I know we're saving questions till the end, but I will pass it off to Tania, I believe, right? Is that what the plan is?
Yep, Tania, I think you're able to share your screen. Can you stop sharing, Brian?
Okay.
There we go.
All right, let's see if this will work for me. Yeah. There we
you
go.
Looks good.
Can you all see that?
Yeah. Looks
Okay,
Tania.
great. Perfect. Well, thank you, Brian. That was a great presentation. I love all of the beautiful pictures and whatnot. That is the one thing that, you know, if in another life I come back, I'll do something more earth science-y kind of related, because there are a lot more better visuals to use in your presentation than death and you know, hospitalization and things like that, which portray a lot of what I research. So again, my name's Tania Busch Isaksen. I'm an associate teaching professor with Department of Environmental Occupational Health Sciences, and I'm a co-director of the Collaborative on Extreme Event Resilience Lab with Dr. Nicole Arrett. And my presentation is going to be one that will hopefully highlight some of our research to practice projects that we've embarked on since 2017, when most of us got real interested in wildfire smoke research. Guess I gotta click. All right. So, you know, with any great presentation, it's got to start with a meme, right? A great meme. So how it started for our laboratory was in 2017 when, you know, we all in this particular, you know, population center experienced our first statewide smoke event, 2 different events. And how it's going right now, well, we've got, you know, in the month of February, Colorado has a couple of wildfire smoke events going on right now, one of which is like only 5 miles from where my elementary school aged house is. I grew up in Colorado. So that is, how it started and how it's going right now. For our lab in particular, in 2017, as I mentioned, we experienced the 2 statewide events that really woke a lot of people up as to how wildfire smoke and wildfire events were going to impact the western part, or the most populous part of Washington state. Yes, as Brian has previously said, that wildfires and wildfire smoke is not unique, or not new rather, to Washington state, but certainly on the west side of the Cascades, it's not something that we had experienced in the way that we experienced in 2017. And so both Dr. Ayrton and I were during those events, receiving a lot of calls from our practice partners, wondering what kinds of messages, health-related messages, they could put out to their citizens. Who is most at risk, what were they at risk of, what kinds of interventions could we recommend, et cetera. And we didn't have a lot of answers for them. We were also part of what's called a hot wash. So after an emergency event, agencies getting together to talk about what went well, what didn't go well, and how to improve future responses. And what Dr. Ayrton and I came away from that meeting really knowing was that, there were a whole lot of agencies, nonprofits, et cetera, that were very interested in the response to wildfire smoke, that weren't speaking to one another, that were, not connected with the right information or the right sources for a public health response. So one of the things that we felt that we could do was to convene all of these groups together. And so, as one does in the university setting, we wrote a grant to try and help support convening all of these public health related agencies and nonprofits, tribes, et cetera. And our first grant attempt failed. And so, as one does, you apply for another one. And we got that grant, and it was actually through a program on climate change. So this is all because of you all. And it was a small conference grant. And so we leveraged a whole bunch of other sponsors and our own lab money to convene this group. And it was titled the Wildfire Smoke Risk Communication Symposium, Stakeholder Symposium. And it didn't actually occur until 2018, so the fall of 2018. And as Brian has already shown us, there was a second, event in 2018. It actually was a dual event. And so by the time October 2018 rolled around and our symposium was announced, this was the hottest ticket out there, so to speak. We had way more people actually wanting to attend than we had spots for faculty, for state and local health agencies, nonprofits, et cetera. And, the purpose of trying to get everybody together in one location was really intentional to basically seed collaboration so that different groups could have an opportunity to talk with one another and then go forth and, do something else, whether it's, talk about how they're going to communicate around wildfire smoke, or if it's testing these certain interventions they were interested in, or, drafting policy. Those were a lot of the side conversations that we heard occurred during this stakeholder event. But the symposium itself was designed, the early morning session was a state of the knowledge type of session. We had several speakers. I think actually we've got a couple that are on the call today that were there. And the second part was designed as a World Cafe type of data collection event. And we split these, the discussions into 4 different big categories or communities: urban, rural, workers, and at risk. And we actually had 2 sets of each of those. And we asked in a round, so you sit down at one table and you chew out, talk through, and discuss the first question that was posed to the group. And then you get up and you switch to a different table and you receive the second question, third, and the fourth. And so those were questions around who did the people at the table feel were uniquely susceptible to wildfire smoke in the community that the table was focused on, how we can effectively communicate to those populations that were represented by people at that table, how can we reduce risk to that population, and then how can research improve preparedness and response moving forward. And so we basically ended up with this great research agenda by the end that was, created by all of these great minds coming together and expressing their practitioner needs. And so we grouped them into these big buckets of research topics: exposure, health risk, risk communication, behavior change / interventions, and legal or policy. And just to highlight some of these, so from exposure, remember that this is back in 2018, and to some extent we're still, grappling with this issue, but just the definition of a wildfire smoke event itself is one that, it varies depending on the author of the study, basically. And so trying to come up with a consistent definition was something that the researchers in the room wanted to see. The practitioners in the room, though, wanted to understand whether or not there were concurrent exposure issues with pesticides and wildfire smoke, or if automobile cabin air filters were going to be adequate to filter out PM coming through if they had, workers in a cabin or in a car or truck. For health risks, very little at that point in time was really known as to what the impacts were to these high concentration PM events, not only short-term, but also long-term or cumulative exposure. So we were starting from the basement level there, just trying to understand what the basic risks were, and then if we had any particularly susceptible populations. Risk communication, trying to understand what risk perceptions were and determinants, evaluating specific messaging approaches, what worked, what didn't work. With behavior change and interventions, there was a lot of discussion at that time around N95 respirator use and its effectiveness, clean air rooms. Again, the automobile cabin air filters came up. So trying to understand how effective those interventions were. And then legal policy related questions or research needs, and this was really focused on outdoor workers. How can we establish policy that will protect workers that primarily spend their time outdoors for their job? So we started to get to work, actually. And by we, I mean like the royal we. We benefited, much like Brian said, he benefited from a whole community of researchers and practitioners. We also, as well, benefited from our huge network of practitioners, collaborators, and primarily from our students that are very interested in this kind of research. So in 2018, we actually had 4 undergraduate students that went out into the field and did a variety of different things. And this individual here, Amanda Durkin, she went ahead and she helped the Methow Valley Methow Valley Citizens Council, I always mess their name up, establish a monitoring network using low-cost sensors, so purple air monitors. And at the time, when they initially began this project, the thought was that they wanted to establish these monitors to measure impacts of wood smoke during the winter time. And, it just so happened all these monitors came in right before the 2018 wildfire smoke season for the Methow Valley, which they are very accustomed to wildfire smoke and prescribed burn smoke and wood smoke in their area. But in 2018, actually, let's see here if I go back. This is a picture from our practice partner out there, Dr. Walker, and this is in 2018. And the little red circle is the sun. This is midday. And this is, they basically experienced 40 days of this kind of air quality out there. So we had students in the area at that time setting up a monitoring network that could better help to inform individuals in that valley. And she also collected information then on why the individuals volunteered to establish these, basically they were clean air ambassadors, so they were establishing the network and maintaining the network for the Methow Valley Citizens Council. And what she found from the 19 volunteers was that they either perceived that their personal or their family was susceptible to wildfire smoke, or they were just simply interested in the benefits that it could provide to their community in way of additional information. Some were interested in how they could reduce their exposure, and they also had some of them had indoor monitors. They would look to see how they could actually reduce their exposure indoor as well. How they use the data, they generally use them to take protective actions. So in other words, to make decisions about what they were going to do during days of high PM concentrations, engage in awareness of building and community discussions around air quality. So again, a lot of this was initially, motivated by the wood smoke during the winter time. And so this gave them the opportunity to study how wood smoke impacts their neighborhood air quality and then engage in meaningful conversation at the community level. For future project ideas, they had a number of them using the information for other seasonal air quality issues, which I think I just pretty much beat that dead horse. Using to promote awareness of other forms of pollution, also allowing or encouraging schools to really understand their air quality, so using those in the school and the community. And then one of the questions that we had asked them was about project challenges, and I think these are important if you're going to try and set up a low-cost sensor network in, wherever you would like to do that. Is the access to internet is really important, because all of this data, it gets sent up to the cloud and you can view it on Purple Air website. But it also has to be plugged in. I mean, it requires an electrical source. So that is a challenge if you're off grid, or you want to locate it in a place that just, is like, needs a very long extension cord. So those are all of the things to take into consideration with that. Okay, so then we started thinking about, so that was kind of our exposure piece that we were starting to pursue, thinking about, the low-cost sensor value. There are some complications with the low-cost sensors. They're not super accurate, but that in large part, EPA has taken a good stab at trying to come up with correction factors that work pretty well for something like the Purple Air. So then we get into the health effects of wildfire smoke. And, if we look at the literature around just general health effects from PM, there's quite a bit out there with what's called TRAP pollution, so traffic related particle pollution or air pollution. And what we do know around the normal background PM is that, it is associated with cardiovascular disease. It impairs blood vessel function, messes with your arteries and your good cholesterol, et cetera. So there's a good amount of information out there around cardiovascular disease, same with respiratory disease, reduces lung function. It's associated with developing and exacerbating emphysema, asthma, COPD. There's also expanding literature around its link to cancer, breast, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and lung. And there's current research in our own department looking at the connections between TRAP and Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other dementias. So there's a good amount of information out there from just this traffic related. But what isn't really, there isn't a ton of information in the literature around the health effects associated with these high PM events that we are now experiencing with wildfire smoke days. So we started to look at that. And the first study that we conducted was a mortality study. And so we looked at, for 2006 through 2017, all non-traumatic mortality in Washington State. And this is actually research conducted by Annie Doubleday. So she's a former MPH student, but now back for PhD. And she looked at all non-traumatic mortality using a time-stratified case crossover design, so an EPI study. And this is a really slick, nice design, in that the cases actually compare to themselves, so controls for confounding. And therefore, you can do a lot of interesting analyses with this kind of study design because you don't need the denominator with population, which is very handy when you're moving across geopolitical boundaries in which you generally will get the population data from. Okay, so it compares exposure on day of death to exposure on reference days, and we're estimating the odds ratio of the day of death and on the 4 days prior. All right, so, and the exposure metric, of course, is 24-hour average PM and Humidex data. We did control for Humidex, measure of heat. And so our results are, we are seeing a 1% increase in odds of all same day non-traumatic mortality on wildfire smoke days compared to non-wildfire smoke days. And this is controlling for Humidex. It does include 1, so it's not statistically significant. We look at our underlying causes of mortality. You'll see that COPD, you see a 14% increase in the odds of same day COPD mortality, in addition to the rest. And then if we further stratify our causes of mortality by age, we see a 35% increase in the odds of same day respiratory mortality, and a 33% increase in odds of same day COPD mortality. Oops, I don't know why that clicked back. There we go. Furthermore, we went ahead and we looked at the influence that days previous exposure had on day of mortality, day of death. And so our unconstrained distributed lag analysis examines the effect of exposure to wildfire smoke in the 4 days prior to death. And the pattern suggests that the previous day exposure conveys the highest risk, so the day before death. And then it diminishes rapidly until there's no evidence after the 2 days before day of death. So we estimate here that there's a 1.3% increase in odds of non-traumatic mortality given wildfire smoke exposure on the previous day, while holding constant Humidex and exposure on day 0 and 2 through 4. Okay, so that is the health research. We're now moving on and actually looking at ER visits and hopefully hospitalizations in the near future. The data is a little hard to come by right now because COVID. Everything's hard to come by because of COVID. let's see, checking my time here. Okay, so risk communication research. One of the things that we did in 2018 was to take a look at all of the messages that were being delivered out there with local government jurisdictions and media outlets, just to see what the content was, what were they saying, what were they telling people that they needed to do, what kinds of risks were represented in media. And what we ended up finding, and we scrubbed the internet, the entire state, collected all of this data, but we only analyzed 8 different counties representing 57% of the population. And we used the extended parallel process model for this, which basically in a nutshell means that with any risk communication, what you really want is the threat needs to be communicated, but it needs to be a threat that the individual perceives is for them. And there is, coupled with that threat messaging, then an efficacy or an intervention that not only is the intervention efficacious, but that the individual receiving the message feels that they could actually use it or achieve that intervention. So we're looking for the coupling of these types of messages. All right, so we analyzed 85 government and 188 media release wildfire smoke messages in this particular study. And it was this is again in 2018, and there were 2 different events in 2018. And you can see that at least for the first event in August, media was out in front with their messaging. Government lagged a little bit behind, but in the second event, government was up in front. And overall, we found that the government messages included more of the risk and efficacy information combined together, 53% versus 48% with media, and that populations at risk from smoke were specifically identified in only 37% for government and 44% for media messages, which is a problem. And that clean air agencies were the #1 reference source for additional information at 40% and 17%. And just so you get an idea of who the vulnerable or susceptible populations were that we were interested in seeing. And then over on the right-hand side, the types of activities or interventions that we were tracking at the time. And so this research, what came out of it were a couple recommendations to prepare for future wildfire smokes, establishing a framework of good risk communication that emphasized, the combination of risk and efficacy information, and that state and local health departments should increase their presence and become that trusted source of information for public health information. That is something that I feel pretty strongly about, coming from practice. And one of the great things that happened from this is a former student who I think is actually on the call here, now works for Department of Health and does the wildfire smoke risk communication. She was instrumental in creating this wildfire smoke risk communication toolkit. And a lot of the lessons that we learned from the research that we did were built into the messages that we then prepared and are available to all local health jurisdictions on Department of Health's SharePoint site. So that's a win. And then I think, do I have time for one more, Luann?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. And then we might skip the breakout rooms depending on how many questions.
Okay, I'll just do this. I have 2, but I'll just do this one more because, well, Caitlin Kelly is on, I know she's on the line. And so this is her master's research that she completed last year. And so one of the things that we heard a lot in the symposium was the efficacy of N95 masks and the training involved and the education out there. And one of the things that we had done in 2018 when we had sent, those 4 undergrad students out, one of those undergrad students actually created a video on how to don and doff an N95 mask, and this was used on Department of Health's website, and a lot of other people, other health agencies were using this video. And one of the questions that we all had was, well, does training actually impact fit of an N95 respirator? Because in the occupational world, you go through training and you go through fit testing. So you're actually measuring whether or not you got that thing fit to your face, and you're adjusting it, and you're making sure that what you're doing is getting as tight of a seal as possible. And in absence of that kind of one-on-one training, we wanted to know, well, is there other kinds of training that will get you to a proper fit? And so part of what Caitlin did was this experimental study design where she took 40 individuals, volunteers, 3 intervention groups, 1 control group, and used the fact sheet that explained how to don and doff an N95 that was created by Department of Health, our video, and then the manufacturer's instruction cards that come in the box with masks, and then a control group who received no information. We used Home Depot respirators that were properly sized for each individual. And basically, depending on which intervention group you were in, the first thing that happens, you were sized in the proper N95 mask, and you conducted a fit test before any training. You then took a survey, which is a knowledge attitudes and practice survey. And you went through the fit testing and were videotaped putting on the mask and taking off the mask. And then you received some training, one of the interventions, or you sat there if you were part of the control group, and you repeated wash, rinse, and repeat kind of thing, right? And then the other question, and she did a bunch of analyses around the training effectiveness here. But the other question she had was whether or not these one-size-fits-all masks would be adequate, given training. So everybody then donned a one-size-fits-all mask and conducted a fit test after they had completed the training. And so that is what these results are here. And you can see the controls on the left, fact sheet. Down below here on the left is manufacturer and the video. So this is pre and post the intervention, and we see that, pretty much all the interventions you did see an increase in fit factor. So the mask fit better on the face, but the fact sheet actually seemed to perform a lot better than what we had thought the video was going to be the tool that we wanted to use in the future. And then this is using the one-size-fits-all mask. Now remember, this is after training. All of the fit factor scores, pretty much all, except this really weird random one, all of them decreased. And so what that's telling us is that the one-size-fits-all mask is potentially a problem. It doesn't fit well on the face, that it really is important that you're sizing your mask properly before you're donning it. Okay, so we have done some research on policy, but I won't go too much into it other than that, basically there's only one jurisdiction out there that has any sort of regulation around outdoor workers, and that's California. And that's their emergency outdoor worker regulation that they passed a couple of years ago. So in this state, Labor and Industries is actually currently pursuing a similar emergency regulation. So they're in the process of taking information from the public and trying to understand what some of the barriers might be to a policy for every outdoor worker, or if there are some groups that it should be focused more on versus applied to everybody universally. So that is something that's currently going on right now. And I will just end with, 2020 was so much worse than the other years that we had experienced, and that certainly that our mortality research covers. And that there are many additional questions that we're currently pursuing with respect to wildfire smoke. And one being mental health impacts and how some interventions might mitigate mental health impacts for those that are basically trapped indoors for multiple weeks waiting for the smoke to dissipate. So that's something that we have on the horizon. And I'll just end with, there, I had to move my screen out of the way there. So the difference between 2018 and 2020 in the unhealthy category, they're pretty similar. And this is, by the way, population weighted. It's not days, it's population weighted. And over on the right-hand side for very unhealthy, 2020 was measurably different and worse than 2018 when you consider the population. So many more exposed for 5 to 9 days of very unhealthy or worse air quality. And I'll just leave with this last slide. Lots of great resources. I encourage you to go to Department of Health's website, Smoke from Fires. They have a fantastic smoke blog. Air Now is doing a great job of collating and updating information on health effects, and they're actually incorporating purple air monitors into some of their measurements. So all of these great resources. And thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. We only have